This past week has been one of great emotional weight, with thousands gathering in Chicago to protest the death of George Floyd, with the backdrop of the death toll of the pandemic disproportionately affecting people of color. We see how speaking out against injustice is a life or death situation. The work to support Black lives is important work. This is a time that requires action, fueled by courage and hope. This is a time for community. I can imagine how everyone would come together at church today if we were all worshiping in person. How the community would gather after the service in Hull Chapel, and we would all sit around those white tables with a cup of coffee in hand. And we'd share our stories. Stories about what is happening in our neighborhoods, stories about protests of the past, and stories that give us hope. The exchange of telling and receiving our stories is an exchange of that which makes us human. In the face of a system which is attempting to stop the humanity of Black and brown people, the richness of our stories combats the idea that anyone is just a statistic. Instead, it lifts up how we all have our own vibrant history that makes us who we are. This is a moment in our history which requires bravery, resilience, and hope. And in the midst of pandemic and protests, these can certainly feel out of reach. There are times where each of us may feel tired or scared or hopeless. But when we share stories with our community, when we share in that holy exchange of what makes us human, that can give us the boost to keep going, even when it's hard. When we hear a story, it can inspire us to action. When we share our own story, it can remind us of what we are capable of. And the exchange of our stories with one another can help keep us going when we need it most. Just as important as how we share our stories is how we listen. We cannot demand to hear someone else's story. What we can do is enter into a spirit of curiosity, being willing to hear those stories and to remember them. And when the story demands it, make a change. Dr. Thomas King, author and professor of Native Studies, wrote this in his book, The Truth About Stories. Don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard this story. You've heard it now. Telling our stories makes us stronger as a community, makes us empowered to act, and gives us hope for a better future. But we also have an obligation to keep those stories close and really, truly hear them. That sacred exchange of stories is what makes our community thrive. If we were together today at that round table with our coffee, we'd all be sharing our stories. So today, in this virtual space, 6 members of our community will share the gifts of their stories with you.
Happened when I worked in many sort of activist type organizations where we were working to put Blacks on decision-making boards, the decisions that affect the lives of people in the city. And I decided that I was going to get on boards and be a decision maker, as it affected the lives of Black people, African Americans. And since I didn't have a business, I started one. And it was called Proof in Promo. It was a promotional sales service. And today you go in the store and you see people saying, would you like a little cheese? Here, have a glass of wine. And I had already been Miss Polaroid in jewelry stores where I would snap a photo of a client with Polaroid camera when they were new, and I sort of knew how it worked. So I did start a promotional sales service, went to manufacturers and in the city and got accounts and started a business. I was in it for about 3 years, and one winter a snowstorm came along and all of my little accounts across the city were closed. We weren't able to get in stores, and that was the end of my business. But that experience of being a business owner and being able to understand systems a little better, I think was starting that business, I think was one of the bravest things I ever did. But maybe it wasn't, because maybe I just did it because I didn't know any better.
When I was demonstrating in Jackson, Mississippi, as a young man, with a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who they also call SNCC, and that was led by then Stokely Carmichael, who has since changed his name to Twame Toure. The demonstration was to protest the killing of an African American girl and young lady. She was she went to college at Jackson State, then Jackson State College, now Jackson State University. The main street that went through Jackson State College was called Lynch Street. How about that? Lynch Street. Anyway, a white man was driving down that street, and he hit her in his car and he killed her. And that sparked the protest in Jackson. It was a boiling pot prior to that anyway, and things were starting to spill over. That's what really kicked it off. I think I was 17 at that time. Anyway, I had no idea of the consequences of protesting, especially in Jackson, Mississippi, because I had never done it before. I didn't know what I was doing. I was still in high school, but I wanted to be there and represent. Fortunately, I didn't suffer any consequences. The only thing that happened to me was when the police came and everybody dispersed, I ran through a graveyard to get away, and my foot hit a grave, but I kept inside the grave. That's why I kept going. Yeah.
The first story I would like to share has to do with the fact that as a child of about 5, my mother and I were all of a sudden without my father, because my father was killed. He was home on furlough. He was in the Marines, home on furlough, went to Alabama to visit his father. And there we were told that he whistled at a white woman and the sheriff there killed him. That's the only story we ever got. And so the next thing I knew, my mother and I were leaving Mississippi, because by now we were living in Mississippi, not Alabama. And we were on our way to Alabama to my father's funeral. And so that was pretty big stuff to get through. But somehow I managed. And I guess always wondered what it would have been like, how my life would have been different if my father had been with me instead of being killed so early. So I think getting through that experience was like a first sign of bravery, I guess, to be able to get through that.
It's a story about my son when he was 3 years old. And my son is interracial. His father was African American. I'm his mother. And at the time, we were living slightly south of here. And he was going to a nursery school in a community center. And I was teaching on the north side, and I would come home on the train, and I would stop off the train and go to the community center and pick him up from the school, from his nursery school. And we would walk home together. And this one particular day, as we're walking home, he told me, Mom, one of the kids called me and he said the N-word. And I don't think he'd ever really heard that word before, certainly not in our home. And it's not a word he and I had ever talked about. And so suddenly at age 3, there's my child who someone else is trying to insult. And he tells me this word and he wants to know, what does it mean? Contrasting that story, one day he came home from nursery school and he was very excited. And the director of the nursery school, of the community center, was also happened to be an African American lady. And he came home and he said, Mom, Mrs. Brown loves me.
Late last week, I was catching up with my mom, who's also in New York City. And I was telling her, I was having this conversation with Vinny about like all this bigotry and stuff against Asians. I said, I cannot believe that was happening. And she goes on to tell me that, oh yeah, it's true. And it is happening. And as a matter of fact, she's telling me my younger sister, who's really not like that much younger, she's like a year younger than I am, was leaving work. And she works in a neighborhood that's in Brooklyn that's split between Hasidic and Asians. So it's kind of like this weird mixed neighborhood, as many neighborhoods are there. And she walks into a deli as she's coming home. And there's this older woman, not really older, but middle-aged woman, harassing these 2 teenage Asian girls in the deli, like verbally harassing them. And my sister jumped in and encouraged the woman to leave, these 2 Asian girls alone. They're not bothering you. What is your issue? And so on and so forth. And I'm sure, knowing my sister, there was some colorful language used, right? But, I was very proud, not surprised, but proud to hear that she jumped in the moment to tone that down during this time.
Our son, Javi, we've always raised him to be bilingual, and he has always, from a young age, from about age 3, been aware that Spanish isn't something that everybody speaks. And for a while he rejected it, even saying, nobody speaks Spanish but we do, but us, and he clearly figured out that wasn't true after a while. But we kept insisting that we speak Spanish and that he speaks Spanish and that he's Puerto Rican, even knowing that people will discriminate against him for it. And he's experienced that. But now he very bravely says, I'm Puerto Rican, I speak Spanish. And nobody can stop me from doing that. And nobody just should stop anybody from doing anything because of the language they speak or the color of their skin. So
these stories, our collective stories, are what make this church. And the church is so needed right now. We are in a crucial moment. Act in whatever way you can. Protest, write letters to officials, the list goes on. But let the stories you share and the stories you hear inspire you to act. Take their stories, for instance. Jean, Jim, Barbara, Amos, Sarah, and Sophia. Don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard their stories. You've heard them now.